The number one complaint we hear from donors is that they just don't understand what you do. They don't tell us it's innovation. They don't tell us there's not a big vision. The number one complaint is they just don't understand what you do. Maybe even more than that, it's about clarity. I think a lot of times in our sector, we try to be so clever. We try to be creative as social entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders, and we think that we need some viral social media campaign. And I think oftentimes our mind goes to how do we be clever to break through the noise? But it's actually not clever that wins. It's clarity that wins.
Kevin, thanks so much for joining me on the Social Impact Journal show.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
Yeah, really looking forward to kind of diving into your new book that's been released in the past few weeks, and also Mighty Ally's work around supporting nonprofit leaders in terms of their branding and communications. But I know you spent over 15 years helping brands to tell their story, based from the US. So I want to understand your private sector experience, and was there a moment or a spark where you felt that I actually want to work more in the social impact space?
Yeah, it's interesting. All four of us co-founders of Mighty Ally actually started in the private sector. And, in the private sector, when you're working with either big corporations or even startups, I think a lot of this brand communications work is just second nature. It's just what you do, right? It's what investors will even invest in. I think it's just a given that you build your brand, you establish your core identity, you figure out your messaging, your positioning, where you fit in the sector, et cetera. And so, that's what we did for a couple of decades each, whether it's Apple or fintech startups, Formula One, you name it. We had a lot of diverse private sector experience. Yeah, and then for me personally, my personal why is really, my daughters and the orphan crisis really kind of opened my eyes to the need, not only in the nonprofit world, but more specifically even with smaller nonprofits. Having become a family with a little girl in China, and then moving to Uganda, and two beautiful daughters from Uganda, joining our family. I think just through that experience, seeing quite frankly, a lot of injustice and poverty in the world. And then also in that experience, seeing a lot of nonprofits that are fighting these injustices. And sadly, I think a lot of these nonprofit leaders, because they either don't come from a business or brand background, or they don't have the time or team or tools, a lot of them just aren't and weren't focused on the same brand and communications that we saw that worked so well in the private sector. So it's a long way of saying, yeah, a personal journey of mine really opened our eyes to the fact that this work has not previously been prioritized in the social sector by social entrepreneurs.
So tell me about this first step then. So you started looking into this, maybe social enterprises and nonprofits. What did you see in terms of how they were currently tackling this topic?
Yeah. So we lived in Uganda for 4 years, South Africa for many years, and having lived in Uganda, we started shadowing, honestly, a few nonprofits at first. I think we were very careful to not just rush in. I think that's a challenge in our sector, especially from maybe Western or global North leaders like me. I think a lot of times we rush in and we think we have a solution, but I think proximity and immersion is really critical. So for about a year or so, we honestly just kind of listened and learned and watched some of these nonprofit friends and tried to really understand what their challenges were. And I think really the number one challenge we saw is that so many leaders are so passionate about the programs and the products, but again, taking that space and taking that time and having any budget to kind of step back and think about some of these organizational disciplines is just not as second nature in the social sector. So yeah, I think in the book I call it the nonprofit starvation cycle. We're typically just raising enough money to pay the bills, if that, and typically raising just enough money to do just enough programs and feed our products just enough. And so the idea of spending any time or money on brand or even financial management or monitoring and evaluation, some of these disciplines, it's just not as easy for many nonprofit leaders. So I think that's the biggest thing we saw is just this nonprofit starvation cycle. It's just this constant fundraising chase to pay the bills. And so again, when you're in that cycle, it's firefighting mode, and the ability to step back and kind of think long term about like messaging and brand building. It's really hard to do.
No, I can imagine. So you had four co-founders.
Yeah.
So once you kind of started to understand how these nonprofits were dealing with, you call it nonprofit starvation cycle, and perhaps some of the areas of support that you could potentially offer. How did you then start launching your first services?
Yeah. So interestingly, Mighty Ally, our own organization, is a nonprofit hybrid. Our original intention, funny enough, was to be a pure nonprofit, go raise philanthropy and do this work for next to nothing, if not free. That was the original intention. But I think as a nonprofit ourselves, we very early hit some of these fundraising walls. So a lot of what I write about in the book and write about on LinkedIn and in the Substack newsletter was learned through experience, having formed this new nonprofit and just, getting rejected by donors and, trying to raise money and realizing that for ourselves as an intermediary, we weren't implementing the work, and therefore it was going to be very difficult for us to try to raise a lot of unrestricted funding and philanthropy to do this work. I mean, we had some early donor campaigns and some early individual donors that helped us, but we very quickly shifted to this nonprofit hybrid model where we have the nonprofit side for grants and philanthropy, but then we have the B Corp side, which is essentially for the earned revenue. And so, yeah, in terms of services and products, I think from day one it was really all centered on brand. I think our original intention in this sector was to try to really convince people that brand matters and you have to build your brand. And that's something also we learned very quickly, is that the word and the term brand, I say in the book, it gives people the capitalistic creeps. I think a lot of people in this sector, if you're like a public health expert or you're maybe an academic, the idea of brand, it makes some people bristle. And so even though our services from day one have always focused on brand, it took a few years to find this idea and to develop this idea of being fundable and findable. That's obviously the name of the book, Fundable and Findable. And I think that was one of the biggest revelations for us is, we can't make people care about brand, but we can make them think in a slightly different way about fundraising and being fundable and findable. So now all of our services, our framework is called the Fundable Findable Framework. Everything we do is around helping nonprofit leaders and social enterprises be fundable first, then be findable.
Yeah, no. When I saw the fundable and findable, I think it definitely speaks more to the kind of terminology of the social sector. So let's kind of dive into this framework, the fundable and findable framework.
Cool.
So I saw on the website, right, it's kind of brand first, funding second, and that these are very interlinked and critical. So what do you focus on in this framework?
Yeah. So being fundable, we say, is your theory of change and your strategic plan. So that's really figuring out why you exist, what you do, where you're going, who will do it, how you'll do it, and when it will be done. And a lot of people might hear this, maybe listening to this podcast, and they might think, oh yeah, of course we know why we exist and what we do. And there's a big difference from knowing it and then being able to communicate it. And so what it's really about is showing donors why you exist, what you do, where you're going. And that's a very big nuance, right? So like knowing it in your head and then, being able to communicate that to donors is a very big difference. So yeah, being fundable is your theory of change and your strategic plan. And in many ways, that just means, not only doing great work, but showing that great work. And then being findable is your positioning strategy and your marketing communications. And that's all about occupying a distinct space in the minds of your funders and then routinely communicating those promises to them. And again, you might feel like, oh yeah, we are unique. You might feel like, oh yeah, we are doing a lot of, marketing and we're just not breaking through. And I think being findable is about breaking through because there's a lot of noise, right? There's, I think, by some estimates, 10 million nonprofits in the world and social enterprises. So I think that idea of being findable amidst the noise and occupying a distinct space in the minds of your funders, that's all the work we do around being findable. So it's really that magic combination, being fundable, then being findable, then going out and doing the traditional fundraising, right? do the donor outreach, create the prospect lists, write your grant applications, all of that stuff, the traditional fundraising stuff, it comes after your fundable and findable. So that's why we say brand first, funding second.
Got it. So when you talk about kind of cutting through the noise with 10 million nonprofits out there, would you say less is more in terms of communications?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, certainly. I think certainly there are times where less is more. I mean, look, people are busy. They say it's harder to get someone's attention than it is to get a donation. And so, yeah, certainly if it's a busy social media feed, less is more. I think they've even proven with like grant applications, proposal evaluators and grant readers and grantors will even pick the smallest applications first. And so I think there is a lot of times where less is more. Maybe even more than that, it's about clarity. I think a lot of times in our sector, we try to be so clever. We try to be creative as social entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders, and we think that we need some viral social media campaign. And I think oftentimes our mind goes to how do we be clever to break through the noise? But it's actually not clever that wins. It's clarity that wins. The number one complaint we hear from donors is that they just don't understand what you do. They don't tell us it's innovation. They don't tell us there's not a big vision. The number one complaint is they just don't understand what you do. Like we hear from donors that they get a grant application. They go to the nonprofit or social enterprise's website. After reading a grant application and going to the website, they still don't know what you do. And so I think that's where, yes, certain times less is more, but more often than not, even if it's long in terms of how much you say, being just really, really clear is the utmost importance.
Oh, I think that's super interesting, and I think even from my own personal experience, and then talking to to colleagues in the space that that are fundraising, right? You've got so many different types of pockets of funds that you could access, right? Whether they're trusts and foundations, whether it's corporates, whether it's individual, whether it's kind of private sector partners. So what would you say in terms of for an organization that has limited bandwidth, limited financial resources, when they're talking about kind of being findable once they've had the theory of change?
Yeah.
Should they be targeting multiple donor groups or trying to focus on one or two?
Totally. So yeah, that's a perfect segue into being findable because being clear in that theory of change and that strat plan, that's a large part of what being fundable is being clear. And then when it comes to being findable, to your point, tons of different donors out there. I think Bridgespan Group has this concept. It's in the book. It's called the 5 types of donors. It's the government partners, the corporations, high net worth donors, small givers, and foundations. Right? They're roughly the 5 types of donors. I think to your point, a lot of us try to go after all of them, right? Part of that nonprofit starvation cycle is we're often desperate, right? We need to pay the bills. And so we go after this small giver community here and try to get people to donate $10 or 10 pounds online. And then we go after this grant and try to get $100,000. And then we go after this high net worth and try to get, $10,000 or pounds or shillings, whatever it is. But it's just not possible. I mean, I think the data even shows that in order to grow, you have to eventually muster the courage to really focus on a donor type or two. In fact, there have been studies that they look at these big unicorn nonprofits, and not everyone needs to grow and get big. But if you do want to grow, the data shows that most big nonprofits or social enterprises, they do have a dominant funding type. And a lot of people will hear this and think, oh, that's too dangerous. And so we're not talking about a single donor. That's risky, right? We're not saying go after just USAID. Obviously, as we've just seen in 2025, that would be too risky. But if, big aid or government funding is your main type, have a lot of different donors within that type. And focus. That's the name of the game with positioning strategy is, you can't be all things to all people.
Absolutely. And would you have any advice for listeners that are thinking, okay, if I'm to now segment and focus on one or two donor groups, but I really don't know which one is the right fit for me? What would you say to them?
Yeah, totally. That's also the name of the game. Is in the early days, it's a lot of experimenting. We always say like a good brand is both what you're putting out into the world. So that's like kind of what your message and what you can control, but then it has to intersect with that audience. And so you could have the right message and the wrong audience, or you could have the right audience with the wrong message. And that's a lot of what brand building is. That's why we say it's building a brand is really like a science. it's not really an art, it's really more like a science, and you're almost in like a science lab experimenting, right? You're trying on this message or this piece of communications, you're trying on this donor audience, and you're seeing what intersects over time. But you have to eventually figure it out. You have to eventually find that intersection. And yeah, it might take you, honestly, 2 or 3 years in the early days, or maybe if you've made a major pivot, it might take you another 2 or 3 years to really find that right mix. And that's where it can be fun too. I mean, I know this is hard work, and we're dealing with, again, a lot of poverty and injustice in the world that's really dark and heavy. But some of this brand work can be a chance to experiment and have a little bit of fun with the work, and kind of embrace the hypotheses and just try a message and try this donor communication, see what works, and kind of keep track and adjust along the way.
Yeah, definitely, and we'll get onto the book in a little bit. But like when we talk about experimenting, right? I think now with various AI tools out there, and I know this is something you do touch on your social media as well. There's a lot of tools out there, right, for nonprofits that might have smaller resources to use to try things out, to develop some really great images, videos, scripts as well. So, what would you say in terms of that for AI tools?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm probably not an expert on like the exact tools, but I think the big thing we would say is, yes, there are countless generative AI platforms that will help you create the content. I think the challenge is a lot of nonprofits or social entrepreneurs will jump into the tools and try to create great campaigns and creative, and they'll see this great new tool that can create video in minutes, but they don't have that foundational maybe messaging in place, or that foundational brand clarity in place. And so that's why with our clients, we actually don't really get into a lot of the production of content itself as much as we help establish, like for instance, a messaging platform. If you establish a messaging platform with your tagline and boilerplate and the articulation of what makes you unique, and sample copy and sample headlines, like if you establish all of that, which is really your foundational messaging, then you can feed it into the AI tools. You can feed your theory of change into an AI tool of any sort, and then that's where the beauty happens with using a lot of this technology, right? But the challenge is that they say with any technology, like garbage in, garbage out, right? And I know that sounds harsh, but a lot of times we'll type into like GPT or DALL-E or any of these other tools, like, hey, just create so-and-so. And it doesn't really create what we want because we haven't really fed it in the highest quality inputs. And so, yeah, it's a slight non-answer, Jack, but I think less about, which tools and more about what are you feeding the tools.
No, definitely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it comes back to that clarity stage, at the foundational level, right? So
Totally.
I know this is something you do through your boot camp. So it's, what you're seeming to say is it's the production comes after, right? The kind of flashy, glossy content would come, but it's how do you have something where, all of your team are speaking the same language, whether you're at the Skoll week, whether you're, talking to different types of donors. If you have that clarity and clear message, then everyone, people will understand you a lot more.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just as a focus group of one, when I think about how I personally use AI, we'll use AI tools for some clients to do certain things. But when it comes to my own social media or the book or just, the newsletter, other than using ChatGPT for a little bit of a creative sparring partner and, for spell check and whatnot, like I'm not actually using a lot of AI tools, right? I mean, I think the clarity of what I have in terms of positioning of my content and what Mighty Ally has in terms of where we fit in the world, and, brand first, funding second, fundable, findable, all of that came first without any AI tools. And then, second, it came before we even try to create future content.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So I think all of your learnings from your content from Mighty Ally, is culminated in your first book, which also goes by the name of Fundable and Findable. So tell me about this journey. I know you launched this at Skoll Week in this month in April, but there's been a whole journey. I saw on LinkedIn that you had your first draft. Was it March 2024 that you'd finished the first draft? So talk to me about that journey, about kind of putting all of your learnings from the private sector, then with Mighty Ally, on paper.
Yeah, totally. For anyone watching, we'll hold it up just to make sure you see it. Fundable and Findable, the brand new way to fix your nonprofit fundraising. So I mean, this is it's a Mighty Ally product. It is even though I wrote it, it is a piece of our own nonprofit theory of change, right? So we have our consulting practice where we go really deep with typically growth stage clients, and we're generating a lot of learnings. We're developing these tools. We're trying to figure out what works, right? Then we have a training model where we have funders that hire us to do like group workshops. So maybe a funder says, "Here's our portfolio. Can you do group workshops?" And then more and more we have what we call field building. So taking all the learnings from our consulting practice and our training model and really trying to scale the expertise. And so we launched an online course. It's now called the Fundable Findable Bootcamp. It's like this self-paced video course. I write on LinkedIn and Substack. All of that is really part of our efforts to make sure that we democratize these tools and these resources. We want really any leader anywhere to access the same tools. It's a little bit part of that mission to make sure that it's not just the larger organizations that can afford a partner like us. We want even a little 2-person charity and whatever wherever they're based to be able to access the same kind of expertise. And so that was really the impetus for writing the book. Is we just wanted to continue scaling this expertise, making it as accessible as possible. We have this online course. It's like $199 US. That feels very accessible compared to tens of thousands of dollars for a consulting engagement. But for many small organizations, even spending $200 US for a course is a big investment. So that was really the impetus for the book. And taking all the content and the learnings and packaging it up so that for $24.99 US, anyone can access the same resources.
Fantastic. And I know that you launched this at Skoll. So tell me about that launch event and being able to interact with so many change makers in person.
Yeah, so Skoll World Forum, arguably the biggest gathering in our sector, right? I think the Skoll Award itself is probably as prestigious as it gets. Not only do you get named a Skoll Award winner, a $2 million prize that comes with it. So yeah, it just felt like not only the right place to launch the book, but also just a huge honor. Just being in that setting with so many amazing leaders and conversations. And so, yeah, we had a book launch and joined a couple of donors for conversations with their portfolio. And, I think what was the most humbling and honoring moment was at the book launch. We had 4 of our clients and partners join us. We had 4 leaders from 4 continents, all of whom we had worked with either through our consulting or training practice, and all of whom were in the book. And so it was a really special moment where, these leaders from around the world got to talk about how they became fundable and findable and how it led to funding for them. And I think, best of all, we had Community Health Impact Coalition, Dr. Madeline Ballard, the CEO. On Wednesday, she joined the book launch. And then on Thursday, they won the Skoll Award for social entrepreneurship and the $2 million prize that came with it. So it was quite cool to be able to have one of this year's Skoll Award winners not only in the book, but join us at the book launch.
That's so cool. That's so cool. And, there's a couple of phrases when you were, on the book website that really, got me. And, one of them is, anything is possible, but everything isn't. And the second is, complicated missions complicate fundraising. So talk to me a little bit about this. And I guess they come back to the topic of this discussion, which is clarity.
Yeah. So those are 2 of the 20 or so laws that the book will teach you. And so, this idea of anything is possible, everything isn't. It's both this hopeful phrase of, look, anything is possible. Many of us can do so many things with our work and with our time, with our organizations, but everything isn't. And so that applies to your theory of change, right? So, any intervention is possible. You could probably go create any innovation, any product, any program, but you can't do it all. The same thing with your positioning. Anything is possible in terms of which donors you want to target, but every donor isn't possible. Same with your marketing communications, right? Any channel is possible. Social media, email marketing, public speaking, whatever, but everything isn't possible. So even though that phrase applies to one specific chapter in the book around setting your priorities, which is part of your strategic plan, I think that law can apply to really so many elements of being fundable and findable. And then, complicated missions complicate fundraising. I mean, that goes back to what I said at the beginning is the number one complaint we hear from donors. And for anyone listening or watching, please take that away. The number one thing that donors want to understand is, what do you do? And so if you complicate your mission with a bunch of programs and interventions and jargon and buzzwords, in the book, I have this little story about sitting across from a funder, and two social entrepreneurs were pitching her, and they just rambled on and on with buzzwords, systems change and scalable and holistic and community led, and she just couldn't understand what they do. And so finally she essentially got up and walked away. So again, we sometimes think that the more we say and pack into our missions, the cooler and the better it sounds, but it's actually the opposite. It can only do us harm.
Do you have any tips for that? So let's say, if you are trying to kind of boil this down to, a couple of sentences, for example, when a funder says, what do you do?
Yeah.
Is there any frameworks or, things that you tried that have worked in that sense?
Totally. Yeah. So the book is full of frameworks and tools. I mean, that's one thing we wanted, is to make sure we didn't write just a conceptual book about brand. It's really actionable. Every single chapter, has these action steps with frameworks and formulas and tools to actually go and implement. And so I think two of the tools that I would think of about your mission, or to your point, Jack, when a funder says, what do you do? That mission statement, one of the favorite tools that we use in the book and that we borrow from Malago Foundation. Malago, a West Coast funder, one of the most prestigious out there, just in terms of, great thinking, but also a ton of great grantees. They have a great tool called the 8-word mission statement. You can look it up. It's also in the book, but yeah, they have this 8-word tool, and they believe, and we believe in the book, that if you can get your mission down to 8 words and really just choose every single word carefully, that can just do wonders for donors. So there's that tool. And then I also say in the book that, this idea of a pitch without a problem is a problem. So when a donor asks what you do, don't actually respond immediately with what you do, because the psychology shows that donors, all humans, they have to understand a problem before they can care about a solution. And so there's a little framework that anyone listening to this pod can use, and it's called bad thing, your thing, good thing. And so the idea is, for like an elevator pitch, or when a donor asks what you do, first say the bad thing. So that's kind of like the problem or the social challenge you're trying to address. Next, say your thing, which is that 8-word mission or something around your work. Then finally say the good thing, which is more the payoff, the vision, maybe the 10-year target. And so bad thing, your thing, good thing. That's the type of formula that you hear it and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's not so complicated. But I think without those formulas and tools, sometimes we just ramble and don't quite get to the point.
No, that's super interesting, because I think, again, back to even my personal experience, I think we've we had difficulties in the past with this as well, where you're talking to a donor that doesn't necessarily understand the specific thematic area that you're focusing on, right? And as a social entrepreneur, nonprofit leader, you've kind of married that problem. You're so kind of deep into it, maybe even too deep, in a sense that then you're talking very technical jargon. So trying to kind of bring you back to that, and having a very simple bad thing or problem statement that you can do, so that anyone can understand, okay, this is a challenge that's worth tackling, that's worth solving. Is super interesting. But the 8-word mission, that seems so difficult, right? How can you bring that down to just 8 words?
Yeah, we do it in our training workshops with our consulting clients. We've never met a client. So we've worked with, I think, 350 clients in 50 countries or something. We've never met an organization that can't do it. But yeah, it takes that courage that, anything is possible, but everything isn't. And you have to choose, every word carefully, and you can't try to say every program, right? And it's such a great exercise, because it just forces you. And we do it in our training programs, and people will type in their 11-word version and 12-word, and we'll say, nope, not even reviewing it until it's 8 words, because it just forces you to pick. It forces you to say what is most important. Then we actually have a formula in the book where you can build on it from there. You can add some pieces and have maybe a 15 to 30-word mission statement. But yeah, that type of tool can be like I guess what they call a forcing function. If you're forced to choose 8 words, what would those 8 words be? It can be so valuable.
Yeah, definitely. And there's another thing, as part of the book, that you say is either your best or your worst fundraiser for the organizations. So what is that?
Yeah, that's your website. So I think I forget which chapter. It's like chapter 14 or 15. The whole chapter is about websites, and the subtitle is "A website is your best or worst fundraiser," and the belief there is that it is the only fundraising employee, quote, that raises money 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, There was an old quote that, a bad website is like a grumpy salesperson. And so we say, yeah, your website's the front door of your brand. Everything you do in being fundable and findable, your theory of change, your positioning, your messaging, it all should culminate there. Like it should be the most important one pager, so to speak. That homepage even should tell and sell a single story. But it's kind of one of those things where a lot of us, as social entrepreneurs, we think, oh yeah, whatever, we're doing the work. Yeah, we'll worry about the website later. But every single donor audience and probably even government partner and an employee, future staff, like almost every single person that will ever hear about your organization will visit the website at least once. And so yeah, we love using that as as kind of, again, the culmination of all your brand work. It really should be showcased on your website.
And what do you see from looking at, at organizations around the world in this space? What do you see in terms of the current, how our website's designed? Do you think there's a lot of work to be done there, especially for maybe smaller organizations?
Yeah, totally. I think many websites just don't, meet the standard of the work, right? And I think that's the discouraging part is so many people listening to the show and doing the work as we speak are doing such incredible work, and then our websites just don't portray it, right? So I think either it's just not built out right. It might just be maybe a kind of like a crummy one page Squarespace site that just doesn't tell the story at all, or maybe worse, it can just be too jammed together, right? Like all these sub pages and places to click and just lengthy text, right? So I think for either one reason or another, a lot of our websites just don't quite tell the story, and they don't have to be too complicated either. We have a formula, it's in the book, and we use it with our clients. It's called like the 1-3-5-7-9 formula. And again, just having some formula that even just gives you a breakdown of how to build a website, I think that's often what's missing. Many of us have like a friend that can help us with the website, or we could get some pro bono agency down the street, but it's kind of having that strategy and that structure that's often missing.
Definitely. I was about to ask that, so, a non-profit that's on a budget that might say, I can't develop, a kind of super world-class website because of the funding constraints. So when you talk about the 1-3-5-7-9 rule, is that more on the content strategy and kind of the wireframe and formulation? But for those that, maybe budget is a big concern,
Totally.
how can you still have a website that, talks the right, talks a clear message on a budget?
Yeah. That 1-3-5-7-9, it refers to one call to action. So just being super clear about what is the website for. 3 audience goals. So make sure that each of those audiences that you've picked have some sort of kind of path to proceed. These 5 sitemap pages. So really that's all most organizations need is 5 pages. These 7 homepage sections. And then as you talk about budget, the 9 in that formula refers to $9,000 average. And what that means is there are many nonprofits that are much bigger that might spend 20, 30, 40, even $50,000 on their website, but that's really uncommon, even in our world. We have clients that will get a Squarespace, freelancer to do a great website for $2,000 or even less. Look, Mighty Ally, we launched in 2017, and for the first 3 or 4 years, we didn't have anyone working on our website except for us, and we used Squarespace. We paid whatever, I don't know, $99 a year for this platform, and we used their templates, and we picked some colors and everything. And so even Mighty Ally, for the first few years, had just a very, very cheap website. But again, we had that website strategy, we had that clarity, we had the messaging, and that's often what's missing.
No, I think that's encouraging to hear as well. I think definitely, and we'll make sure to include links in the show notes for those watching or listening that want to learn more about Mighty Ally on the consulting practice and the bootcamp, and also for the new book, which I'm sure is going to be a hit. And congratulations on launching that, and also seeing you're already topping some of the rankings, which is really cool to see.
Thank you. Yeah, it hit bestseller in four Amazon categories, which is just a huge honor. And yeah, again, this book is part of our mission. We just want any leader anywhere to fix their fundraising. So I think that's that's totally the goal, is less about bestseller and more about just getting it into the hands of as many leaders as possible.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So to finish up, Kevin, and I really appreciate you coming on this show. There's a question I ask to all of my guests, and this is if you had your own social impact journal. But let's say, with your new book, Fundable
Yep.
and Findable, if you take one page from that book and then transport that into a social impact journal. So maybe this is one framework or one piece of advice that you really want a leader to hear on this podcast that they can take forward as an actionable insight and step to fix their fundraising. What would you write in that book?
Yeah, so funny enough, I flipped to page 9 of the introduction. I think that's what comes to mind. And in that section, I'm talking about how only 1 in 1,000 nonprofits will grow beyond a small business. Even in the United States, where foundations have $1 trillion sitting in the bank, even in the States, 88% of nonprofits struggle on less than $500,000 a year. It's on and on. I say that it's a valley of death with nowhere to grow, right? This speaks to that nonprofit starvation cycle. So what I say on page 9, and to answer your question, Jack, is, we feel like it's just fundraising. It's pitching. It's constantly guessing. We chase money, right? And then I say in bold, more fundraising itself can't fix your fundraising. So this is kind of challenging that idea in our space that fundraising is not the answer, that we just do more of it. Doing more of it is not the answer, right? And so I say that to tackle and to break this nonprofit starvation cycle, we must tackle the problem differently. Of course, you need to fundraise eventually, but if your income has stalled, stop what you're doing, stop chasing donations, gather your leadership team, and do this instead. To get funding, be fundable and findable. And then I go on to explain what that means. And so that's why we call it a brand new way to fix your nonprofit fundraising. Of course, it is building your brand, but it's really just changing that dynamic and shifting the way we think about fundraising and quit this idea of a chase, right? Stop, build the brand, be fundable and findable, and then go out and do the fundraising. I think that's the page I would write in my journal, and I would hope people take away from this is it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be so difficult. It doesn't have to be this fundraising chase and this really miserable exercise that I think many of us hate. We can tackle the problem differently.
Absolutely. Kevin, thanks so much for joining me on the show. It's been really, really fun.
Yeah, likewise, Jack. Appreciate it.